Sony did not invent mirrorless cameras, but they did get into mirrorless very early on, back in 2010. And while I've talked a lot about APS-C mirrorless cameras on this channel, I've never actually looked at the very first mirrorless camera that Sony has ever released. And this thing was released back in the middle of 2010. Here it is. This is the Nex 3. And I picked this little camera up for $50. In this video, I want to walk you through some of the specs and features of the Nex 3 and talk to you just about how important this camera is, first of all, because the timeline of it, I mean, if you guys remember when I picked up the Sony a7, the first full-frame mirrorless Sony camera, this was released in December of 2014. The APS-C variant, the very first mirrorless camera that Sony ever produced, was released in 2010. And so this was 4 years older than the oldest full-frame camera. And dare I say, if it wasn't for the success of these smaller APS-C cameras, we may not have all of the great full-frame cameras that we know and love today. So let's get into checking this little thing out. So what exactly do we have here? Well, this is a 14.2 megapixel APS-C censored camera from Sony. And again, this is their first time ever delving into the world of mirrorless. This is also the first time that they featured their E-mount on a camera. After the launch of the Nex 3 and the Nex 5, the E-mount took over completely. And I should mention that this camera was released alongside the Nex 5, which is kind of the higher end model, if you can call it that. It had the exact same APS-C sensor. However, with the Nex 5, you got a magnesium alloy body, which was lighter and actually smaller. You could shoot at 1080i, that's right, 1080 interlaced, not progressive, versus 720p progressive on the Nex 3. Personally, I prefer P, so 720p in my opinion is a little bit better than 1080i, but that's just me. So that was the Nex 5. Maybe one day I'll pick up one of those for a review. Let's get back to the Nex 3 though. The Sony Nex 3 was marketed as a camera that would give you DSLR-like image quality without the bulk. And you could see right here just how compact this camera was when it was released. The impressive thing about it is that prior to the release of this camera, there were a couple of Micro Four Thirds sensors, smaller sensor cameras, mirrorless cameras that were released by other companies that were larger bodies than this little thing. So the fact that Sony crammed a larger APS-C sensor into a smaller camera body was a feat of engineering at that point in time. Now, using this camera, it's more like a point and shoot than an actual DSLR or any sort of modern mirrorless camera. Now, comparing it to the A6100, it doesn't have an electronic viewfinder, so you really can't put it up to your eye. It is significantly smaller. The grip is definitely a lot shallower. Interface, as far as the menu system, is very simplified. There are only 6 items in this menu. Now, one of the great things about this camera is that it has basically a user manual built into the menus. As you move to select another icon, it pops up with a description of what's included inside of that menu. And there aren't a ton of buttons on the back of this camera. In fact, there are really 2 buttons as well as the directional pad and scroll wheel, and then a giant record button at the top. So this was a simple and easy camera to use. If you were intimidated at all by using a DSLR with a bunch of knobs and switches, then this was a lot easier. Now, as far as specs, don't get too excited. Again, this is Sony's first mirrorless camera, so the specs are not crazy. As far as autofocus, this camera did have autofocus. Autofocus points, you don't get the 425 autofocus points that you get with the current line, A6100. You had 25 autofocus points with this little camera. That's right. And they weren't phase detection autofocus points either. They were just contrast detection, the worser of the two. So the autofocus is slow and it hunts a bit, and it's definitely not as accurate as modern Sony cameras. Where you definitely notice the poor autofocus performance is when you start to shoot video with the Nex 3. Now, speaking of video, you can only record at 720p and 30 frames per second with the Nex 3, and it did have a record limit. You can shoot at up to 2.3 frames per second with the Nex 3. with autofocus. So it's not great for sports or action. Now you can turn off the focus, and if you want to manually focus and then shoot burst, that gets you up to 7 frames per second, which is a lot better. It's a very shallow grip camera, so don't expect a whole lot, especially if you have larger hands. Even having the 16-55 lens that I have on this camera right now, it is very difficult to handhold this comfortably. At the top, you had left and right microphones. You had a little flap that had a connector for, you guessed it, a flash. So external flash that you could purchase for this camera, and it kind of just screws into place. When you didn't need it, you could remove it and then close that top flap down. Around the side, you had mini USB as well as a mini HDMI connection. On the bottom, you have a standard tripod mount as well as the battery compartment. This camera featured the NP-FW50 batteries that Sony has kept for 10 years. The screen on the Nex 3 did move, so you could flip it up like this, almost 45 degrees, or you could tilt it down a little ways so you can get some different angle shots if you're trying to do kind of a top-down photo or maybe a low-angle shot. Again, you don't have any sort of digital or optical viewfinder with this camera, so you do have to use the screen to compose your shots. So that is it for the specs and features, and you might be thinking it sounds like a garbage camera, but it's actually not that bad. In fact, I took it out with a good lens. Mind you, the lens that I'm using here is $1,300. I'm using this on a $50 camera body, but I took some sample photos and a couple of videos. Let's check them out. So I admit, for video, 720p is pretty terrible as you compare it to 4K, but for photography, this is not a bad camera at all. The autofocus is very slow, not very accurate, so you do have to kind of sit there and wait for it to hit, but once it does hit, the images are relatively sharp actually. I did do a comparison shot between the Nex 3 and the A6100 really quickly, and you can see here the A6100 is definitely noticeably sharper, has better colors, better skin tones, but the Nex 3 is not horrible, and certainly nowhere near what you would expect from a mirrorless camera that you could pick up for 50 bucks. The Nex 3 really is a classic, and I'm surprised that the prices on these cameras have gone to such low levels, because you would think the first model of something that has created kind of this huge community of Sony E-mount and full frame and all that fun stuff would be a little bit more revered. But I suppose that you can look at that as a positive, because maybe if you have some kids that are interested in picking up photography, maybe if you are on a super duper tight budget and all you want to spend on a new camera is 50 bucks, absolutely pick up one of these things. And at least for photos, I mean, you're going to struggle a little bit with the autofocus, but once you get beyond that, it is a decent performing camera, especially for the money. A lot of bang for your buck here. Now, when this camera was released 10 years ago, part of the problem was the lenses back then were pretty terrible. There were 3 lenses that were initially offered with this camera body. The first was the 18-55 kit lens, which I did a comparison about several years ago. It's not as sharp as the newer power zoom 16-50, but it's an okay performer. The second was, in my opinion, probably one of the worst lenses that Sony has ever invented, the 16mm f2.8, which I did a review about. I compared it to the 16-50 kit lens, and I found that that prime lens is softer than the Pillsbury Doughboy. The third lens that was offered was a 18-200 zoom, which also doesn't get very positive reviews, but I have not reviewed that lens. So if you pick up one of these cameras, let's say for $50, you could go out and buy yourself a nice and cheap manual lens. For example, I have the Pergear 25mm f1.8 right here. You can buy one of these for around $60 on Amazon. And with this combo, well, first of all, you have to use manual focus, but that's less of an issue because the autofocus isn't so great on this camera anyway. You can still get some decent image quality with this type of lens on this cheap camera body. I mean, you're looking at $100 worth of kit essentially, and you can go out and take some very nice looking photographs. It has definitely been fun using this little camera over the last couple of weeks, and just thinking about how much progress Sony has made with Sony E-mount and their mirrorless cameras. I mean, when you compare this to something like Sony's A9 Mark II, it's just crazy how much they have developed and improved these cameras and everything inside of them. But this is the one that started it all. It is the grandfather, if you want to call it that, to the A6000. Pretty cool piece of history, I think. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks for all of your likes, comments, and support. Subscribe to this channel if you are not yet subscribed. Like this video. Thank you guys. Stay tuned for more. I have some exciting videos coming up very soon. See you guys later. Bye-bye.